Hello, my name's Daniel Holtgen. I work for the Council of Europe, and I have the great honor and pleasure to host a panel here today on environment, climate change, and human rights. So I would like, if I may, to start with a question to you, Clover. You have spent a lot of time working with young people in particular, trying to get rid of their angst, their inhibitions, and turning that helplessness into something active. Now, we're all faced at the moment with a completely different crisis, the pandemic. Do you think we can turn people's justified, perhaps, fear that they have into something more positive, to look beyond the pandemic or to help overcome it? I think some of your work is related to the mental state of mind when we are faced with crises. How do you think we can improve that situation in the face of the pandemic?
Absolutely. So the climate crisis is the symptom of broken systems. From the clothes I'm wearing to the food in my fridge or how I got here from London. And so the change that is required is at that system level. There is no hope in another 10 years of incremental change. Now, the bedrock of these broken systems is a system of capitalism based on limitless growth with finite resources entrenched in a centuries-long history of the oppression of marginalized communities of color, of women, of indigenous people, the custodians of our land. And it's also based on a millennia-long history of the commodification of nature, valuing the tree not for its ecosystem services and the oxygen that enables us to breathe, but for the table it provides or the palm oil going into one of our chocolate bars. Now, ecological crises, of which the pandemic is one, the pandemic was caused by this exploitation of nature, show us not just how broken these very systems are, but how fragile and how ripe for disruption. We have an opportunity before us as we're forced to press pause on our hyper-consumptive, globalized lives to think about the future that we want to create and to think about how each and every one of us, politicians, business leaders, concerned mums and dads, students, can step up to become custodians, to rethink so much of how we live, breathe, and exist in the 21st century.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much. Thank you. Can I talk to you, Aron, turn to you? I have a question to you. You've worked with governments and international organizations, with businesses in tackling climate change. How do you think you could work, or how could these entities work to promote fundamental rights? Is that the same kind of issue?
Thank you, Daniel, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. Speaking from the United States, let me start by saying that our democracy here is undergoing an existential test right now. And I don't know if any of you were up at 4 a.m. in Athens to watch our presidential debate, but I fear that democratic norms and institutions and processes are facing a very substantial challenge. This is something that Europeans know all too well from the tragic history of the 20th century. We cannot take democracy for granted, and there is absolutely a role for business to play, and a role that business, in my view, must play to help reinforce the very foundational element of our societies. Our societies cannot thrive in a place where democracy recedes, and no business can either. So this is one of our additional challenges, in addition to climate, in addition to COVID, in addition to the erosion of human rights. I think for businesses, it's time to think about how they can help create 21st century social contracts that reinforce democratic principles, ensure that the private sector and capitalism is aligned towards social benefit and not just the privatization of benefit, ensure that people can have the livelihoods that they need to thrive, ensure that businesses have access to the kinds of capabilities and talents that they need to thrive, and then also take on 21st century challenges that were never part of the social contract previously. How do we transition to a net zero carbon economy in a way that ensures that people are not left behind? And of course, as Clover said, marginalized communities, including racial minorities and also women, are disproportionately at risk from climate change. So we have to build a net zero economy that ensures that all can participate.
Where do you think there is a possibility for proper multilateral cooperation in fighting the pandemic, but also in climate change? Where do you see the deficits, and where would you like to see more and better multilateral cooperation?
The crisis has shown that companies that operate under the more responsible models, taking care of multiple stakeholders, are not surprisingly also the ones that do better during the crisis. Better engaged employees, less pressures, if you want to, better relationships with their suppliers. Now, what we've seen in the COVID crisis once more, I think, is the difficulty of global governance that we now face, as well as governments at a national level. Increasingly, the issues that we face, like the issues of the interdependence of the financial market, cybersecurity, climate change, and now also the pandemics, require without any doubt a global response. These issues know no borders, if I may call it that way. And yet we have seen that we've got about 86 countries putting export restrictions in place around PPE materials. We've seen a lack of cooperation between governments in terms of solidarity. The developing markets, in fact, hardly any cause of the issues that we're now facing, have gotten virtually zero support from the developed markets. So global governance is without any doubts at a low. And the reason it is at a low is that most of the institutions that have been created were created 70 years ago at the time of Bretton Woods. And frankly, unlike businesses or others who might have adjusted their strategies 10, 15, 20 times, global governance has not evolved.
We may have missed the boat for our generation, but what about the next generation? And what about youth involvement?
It's a really great question because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and our failure in the climate and environmental space to shift the conversation away from polar bears and solar panels to how climate solutions must deliver fair, equitable social contracts where we all have equal access to opportunity, where we all have the right to live dignified, respectful lives built on purpose. And we need to become much better at shifting conversations from closed-door rooms to involve and center the very people who are experiencing these impacts firsthand. I come from a bubble of privilege, and while I might have the opportunity to speak in air-conditioned rooms about climate change, there are young people on the front lines of this movement whose livelihoods are at stake, whose homes are getting swept away by rising sea levels, whose food systems are collapsing. And until we deliver solutions that are inclusive and that position the very stakeholders in the center of these conversations, all of our proposed solutions are going to be linear in the context of exponential challenges. So it's critical that we come at this from the question of who isn't in the room and how can we get them there.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to generational justice, which is incredibly important, there's a very practical way that this is influencing how the world is changing. One of the reasons that some of the oil and gas companies have begun to move on climate change more decisively is because they recognize that they can no longer attract the best and the brightest. They simply won't have an employee base if they don't join the 21st century and contribute what's needed in a very profound way on climate. It's very unlikely that Amazon would have moved on climate without a very public display from its employees, and mostly its younger employees, to demand quite publicly that the company adopt an approach that was compatible with what we need to do on climate.
You know, the issue of the young is terribly important, but there is a bigger issue that is coming out with COVID as well, and that is the issue of exclusion of too many people. A world where too many people feel they're not participating or be excluded ultimately rebels against itself. And what COVID has shown is the discrimination that is happening between many different things. The developing countries I talked about, the generational difference you mentioned, the communities difference of indigenous people versus others which have disproportionately been affected, the differences between ethnic classes we've talked about, the difference in gender. What this has done is brought to the foreground that this world is functioning for increasingly fewer people at the expense of others. We now have a small group of 500 people that own $6 trillion. The top 4 people own over $500 billion, and we know them by name. And since January, their combined wealth has gone up 700 billion, whilst the rest of the world is suffering.
All of you have worked in business, in consumer business to a certain extent, and we tend to see young people also as young consumers. Can we educate ourselves and our next generations to do with less?
One of my great frustrations is when we equate an individual's moral contribution to climate change to the business leader whose decisions about their value chain, about the products they put out into the world, equate many millions of individuals. And this is a narrative that has largely been co-opted by big companies to put the onus on the consumer, to put the onus on the individual. Now, 71% of emissions come from 100 companies, right? And even in the context of COVID, when we have pressed pause, the reduction in emissions is kind of negligible when we look at the targets that we're setting out to limit degrees of warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I think we need to break out of this conversation around how we can perhaps shop more sustainably or be a little bit more conscious. I think those decisions are super important to reinforce positive values, represent as a young consumer the brands that you want to align yourself with and the brands that you care about. But otherwise, these decisions need to be made at that level.
Gentlemen, I have to give the final, and I have just given the final word to the lady today. We have no more time left. Thank you for an inspirational panel today to all of you, wherever you are. And thank you, Clover, for being with us here in the audience.